You can't be neutral on a moving train, I told y'all before. You can't believe everything that your teacher tell you. Who was your teacher? Your teacher just learned what they was taught. How do you know what they was taught was correct? Yeah, I mean, dig into the real history of this country and the fact that it was built on blood. You can't be neutral on a moving train.
Welcome to You Can't Be Neutral, a political podcast inspired by Howard Zinn and progressive and radical activism, taking a look at society, media, and politics. You can go to youcan'tbeneutral.com. You'll find back episodes there, and you'll find a link to send me a message. You'll also find some links to make a donation. You can make a one-time or recurring donation to keep this podcast free and independent. This episode I will be reading the 2 months after the International Court of Justice's ruling on Gaza, Escalation in Genocide and Absence of Accountability, published by Euromed Human Rights Monitor, which you can find at euromedmonitor.org. This was published in March of 2024. Introduction. The International Court of Justice, ICJ, issued a decision on 26 January 2024, ordering Israel to take specific provisional measures to prevent the crime of genocide against the Palestinian people in the Gaza Strip. The ICJ stated in its ruling that it was convinced that Israel's actions in the Strip posed a real and immediate threat to the Palestinians there. Additionally, it cited the possibility of irreversible effects and harm to Palestinian rights protected under the Convention on the Prevention and Punishment of the Crime of Genocide. Specifically, the decision came as part of the ICJ's response to a request submitted by South Africa in its lawsuit against Israel concerning Israeli violations in the Gaza Strip since 7 October 2023 of the Convention on the Prevention and Punishment of the Crime of Genocide. The following are the provisional measures that the ICJ mandated in its ruling. 1. The State of Israel shall, in accordance with its obligations under the Convention on the Prevention and Punishment of the Crime of Genocide, in relation to the Palestinian people as a group protected by the Convention on the Prevention and Punishment of the Crime of Genocide, desist from the commission of any and all acts within the scope of Article 2 of the Convention, in particular, A. Killing members of the group, B. Causing serious bodily or mental harm to members of the group, C. Deliberately inflicting on the group conditions of life calculated to bring about its physical destruction in whole or in part, D. Imposing measures intended to prevent births within the group. 2. The State of Israel shall ensure that any military take no steps in furtherance of the military operations referred to in point 1 above. 3. The State of Israel shall take all measures within its power to prevent and punish the direct and public incitement to commit genocide in relation to members of the Palestinian group in the Gaza Strip. 4. The State of Israel shall take immediate and effective measures to enable the provision of urgently needed basic services and humanitarian assistance to address the adverse conditions of life faced by Palestinians in the Gaza Strip. 5. The State of Israel shall take effective measures to prevent the destruction and ensure the preservation of evidence related to allegations of acts within the scope of Article 2 and Article 3 of the Convention on the Prevention and Punishment of the Crime of Genocide against members of the Palestinian group in the Gaza Strip. 6. The State of Israel shall submit a report to the court on all measures taken to give effect to this order within 1 month as from the date of this order. The ICJ re-emphasized on 16 February that the State of Israel remains bound to fully comply with its obligations under the Genocide Convention and with the said order, including by ensuring the safety and security of the Palestinians in the Gaza Strip. The court provided this emphasis in a response to South Africa's second urgent request that it take into consideration Israel's threat to expand its military operations in the Rafah Governorate and to issue additional provisional measures that are necessary to prevent further imminent violations of Palestinian rights in the Gaza Strip. The court did not issue any additional provisional measures as requested, even though it acknowledged in the text of its response that Israel's planned military attack against the Rafah Governorate would worsen the already tragic situation and jeopardize the lives of more Palestinian civilians, and that any Israel military action under the current circumstances would violate the court's decision issued on 26 January. The ICJ only stated that Israel is still committed to its international obligations under the convention and the provisional measures it had previously ordered in this regard. Euromed Human Rights Monitor believes that Israel has not complied at all with the ICJ's ruling. Based on efforts to monitor and document the crimes and violations that Israel has committed in the Gaza Strip, as well as on investigations into and assessments of Israel's level of compliance during the 2 months following the ruling. The majority of the provisional measures outlined in the order were violated, and the crime of genocide was carried out on the same scale. Israel has committed various forms and acts of genocide with the intent of destroying the Palestinian people as a national and ethnic group, including the killing of civilians, targeting of civilians in military attacks, use of illegal, indiscriminate, and highly destructive weapons, infliction of severe physical and psychological harm, starvation, collective punishment, forced displacement, arbitrary detention, enforced disappearance, torture, and prevention of procreation. Israel has also continued its crimes in a manner that renders the Gaza Strip uninhabitable and eradicates its Palestinian identity through the systematic destruction of sources of income, infrastructure, civilian objects, and private property, and the intentional targeting of hospitals, medical centers, and religious, cultural, and historic buildings. First, the measure regarding Israel's obligation to desist from the commission of acts of genocide. A. Genocide by killing. Since the court's ruling, the Israeli army has persisted in deliberately launching massive military attacks against residential areas by air, sea, and land, employing artillery shelling, sniper bullets, quadcopters, rockets, and missiles with enormous undirected destructive capacity. These attacks have resulted in the targeting and killing of thousands of Palestinian civilians, the majority of whom were women and children and uninvolved in any hostilities. Since the court's ruling, the Israeli army has killed over 7,823 Palestinians, including 2,703 children and 1,481 women, and injured approximately 9,746 other people. This brings the total number of Palestinian deaths since 7 October 2023 to 40,156, including 14,405 children, 8,660 women, and 7,800 people who have been trapped beneath the debris of demolished buildings or missing in the streets for long enough that they are now presumed dead. One of the most serious recent crimes committed by the Israeli army took place between 18 and 23 March 2024 in Al-Shifa Medical Complex. In the course of its second raid on the hospital, enforcing a near-total communications blackout, the Israeli army carried out extrajudicial executions and willful killings of Palestinian civilians, including the medical and administrative staff, sick and injured people, and displaced families. As of the time of this publication, the Israeli army has killed at least 200 people inside and around Al-Shifa Medical Complex since it restormed the facility and began carrying out unlawful killing and executions against those inside. On 9 March, Israeli aircraft bombed a house over the heads of its residents in Al-Mawasi, southwest of Rafah. 5 people, 2 women and 2 children, were killed and numerous others were injured. On 12 March, Israeli army forces killed 2 Palestinian fishermen while sailing off the coast of Nuseirat in Deir al-Balah. On 20 and 21 March, the Israeli army also targeted several homes and a residential square in the Nuseirat camp. The buildings were nearly completely destroyed, killing over 40 people, mostly women and children, and injuring dozens more. Flower massacres. Targeting civilian gatherings around humanitarian aid trucks with direct gunshots, quadcopters, and Israeli tank shells is one of the most well-documented examples of the unlawful killings and executions carried out by Israel's army against Palestinian civilians over the past few weeks. These incidents, which have become known as the Flower Massacres, resulted in the deaths of 563 citizens and the injury of 1,523 others. This figure includes civilians who were awaiting aid and workers in charge of planning, securing, and distributing aid. As of 19 March, Euromed Monitor documented 256 deaths in the Kuwait roundabout area, 230 on Al-Rashid Street, and 21 in aid distribution centers. Additionally, records show that 12 aid distribution workers, 2 of whom were from the United Nations Relief and Works Agency for Palestinian Refugees in the Near East, UNRWA, were killed, along with 41 police officers and members of the People's Protection Committees, who were in charge of distributing aid. On 19 March 2024, the Israeli army killed 23 members of the Tribal Protection Committees responsible for protecting and securing aid trucks arriving in northern Gaza. The crimes committed against starving civilians and those attempting to obtain and distribute humanitarian aid are part of Israel's policy of escalating the famine in the Gaza Strip. This policy also involves the shielding of individuals who loot humanitarian supplies, inciting chaos among Gaza residents, and evacuating the inhabitants of Gaza City and the northern Strip to the central and southern parts of the Strip. 2 of the most dangerous flower massacres perpetrated by Israeli army forces against starving Palestinian civilians, particularly in Gaza City and the north, were the 14 March massacre at the Kuwait roundabout and the 29 February massacre at the Nabulsi roundabout. Israeli forces carried out a serious flower massacre on 14 March against Palestinian civilians who had gathered to receive humanitarian supplies near the Kuwait roundabout on the outskirts of Gaza City. More than 80 people were killed and 200 others injured during the massacre, several of them critically. The victims were targeted by artillery shells and machine gun fire from Israeli helicopters, quadcopter drones, and tanks. At around 4:30 a.m. on 29 February, Israeli tanks fired gunfire and shells directly into a crowd of thousands of hungry civilians who had been waiting for hours for aid trucks to arrive near the Nabulsi roundabout on Al-Rashid Street, southwest of Gaza City. As a result, 118 people were killed and 760 people were injured. The shelling operation targeted Palestinian civilians as soon as trucks carrying aid arrived, with dozens falling as they climbed onto the trucks in an attempt to obtain bags of flour. Dozens more were targeted while carrying bags of flour or canned food to feed their families, who were exhausted by hunger. A researcher at the Euro-Mediterranean Human Rights Monitor at Al-Shifa Medical Complex in Gaza City reported that hundreds of injured and dead arrived at the hospital, which operates at partial capacity and lacks sufficient medical teams. Citizens were forced to deal with the wounded and attempt to provide first aid amid a large crowd. Meanwhile, the dead and injured were transported on carts pulled by animals, with some carrying bags of flour mixed with blood. Saeed Thabit Salem al-Rifi told the Euro-Mediterranean team, quote, "We went to receive aid and collected flour by the sea, and they opened fire towards us at around 4:30 a.m. today. As soon as the trucks arrived and people approached them, gunfire started from all directions, turning into a massacre. I managed to get a bag of flour to feed my family of 11, but my friend was killed." Anas Sobhi Abdel Al, said to the Euro-Mediterranean team, "We reached on the Nablus roundabout, and as soon as the trucks entered, tanks began firing shells from all directions. Out of every 10 people, only 1 managed to receive aid. Many were killed or injured while carrying bags of flour or canned food. The gunfire targeted the trucks and their surroundings after the citizens reached them. The trucks became laden with the dead and injured." The Israeli army has tried to evade responsibility for massacring Palestinian civilians who were waiting for aid supplies, claiming that the large number of civilian deaths was caused by a stampede and trampling. However, Euromed Human Rights Monitor's investigations demonstrate that Israeli army gunfire caused the deaths of dozens of Palestinian civilians awaiting humanitarian aid. 200 victims suffered gunshot wounds from bullets which are manufactured inside Israel and used by the Israeli army, and the footage released by eyewitnesses includes audible evidence of gunfire emanating from Israeli tanks positioned near the coast. Further, the footage released by the Israeli forces also indicates that the majority of those in attendance, including those who had initially been far from the aid trucks, were fleeing from them in the opposite direction. 30 Palestinians were either killed or injured on 25 February after being targeted by Israeli army forces while waiting for aid trucks near the Nablus roundabout on Al-Rashid Street, southwest of Gaza City. A 13 March Israeli raid on an UNRWA aid distribution facility in Rafah resulted in the deaths of 6 Palestinian civilians, including a child and an UNRWA employee, and the injury of 22 more. According to UNRWA Commissioner General Philippe Lazzarini, the strike targeting, quote, "one of the very few remaining UNRWA distribution centers in the Gaza Strip, comes as food supplies are running out, hunger is widespread, and in some areas, turning into famine." The Commissioner General stated that UNRWA shares the coordinates of all its facilities across the Gaza Strip with parties to the conflict. Thus, the Israeli army received the coordinates of this particular facility the day before the attack. Since the aggression began 6 months ago, UNRWA has recorded an unprecedented number of violations against its staff and facilities, surpassing violations against UNRWA staff and facilities due to any other conflict around the world. At least 165 UNRWA team members in the Gaza Strip have been killed, including while in the line of duty. More than 150 UNRWA facilities have been hit, leaving some of them totally destroyed. Among these facilities are many schools. More than 400 people have been killed while seeking shelter under the United Nations flag. The killing of Palestinian prisoners and detainees. Palestinian prisoners and detainees from the Gaza Strip held by the Israeli army are frequently subjected to willful and unlawful killings and executions, and many of them are tortured to death. Since 7 October, at least 27 detainees have been killed while being detained in Israeli military facilities, either as a result of severe torture or direct unlawful execution. The Israeli army has refused to reveal the circumstances surrounding their deaths, and no impartial entity has been able to confirm or determine the precise details to date. Not only have their families not been informed of their deaths, but the victims' bodies have not been exhumed, their identities have not been determined, and their remains have not been returned. B. Genocide by causing serious bodily or mental harm. The Israeli army has been carrying out thousands of systematic military attacks against civilians in the Gaza Strip, using highly destructive ammunition and weapons frequently. These attacks have resulted in tens of thousands of injuries, including hundreds of people who have had serious burns and amputations, as well as developed psychological disorders and recurring panic attacks. All of the residents of the Gaza Strip have been suffering from tension and anxiety as a result of Israel's 6-month-long genocide. Meanwhile, Israel still denies the right to essential medical, psychological, and therapeutic care to all Palestinians in the Gaza Strip. Deprivation of the right to health care. Meanwhile, Israel still denies the right to essential medical, psychological, and therapeutic care to all Palestinians in the Gaza Strip. Since Israel has been enforcing a complete blockade on the Gaza Strip, it has continued to target all aspects of the health sector and its infrastructure systematically and widely, including hospitals, health centers, medical personnel, and ambulances. It has launched direct military attacks against these facilities, which involve storming their buildings, destroying their departments and medical equipment, killing and arresting medical staff, and cutting off medical supplies, medications, and medical devices. At the same time, Israel is arbitrarily blocking the ability of injured and sick people to travel outside of the Strip for treatment. Of the 11,000 wounded that need to travel, only a few hundred have been permitted to leave since the aggression began. The rest are still waiting to be allowed to leave in order to receive basic or essential medical care abroad. Many of them have consequently died from their wounds or infections caused by these wounds. Furthermore, for roughly 6 months now, patients with chronic illnesses like cancer, heart disease, diabetes, and high blood pressure have not received the necessary treatment. Patients' suffering is made worse by the unavailability or restricted availability of many kinds of medications, putting their lives at great risk. Numerous cases of patient deaths due to a lack of treatment have been documented by Euromed Monitor, and 350,000 chronic patients are at risk of not receiving the medication they need. According to the Palestinian Ministry of Health, around 10,000 cancer patients are at risk of death if they do not receive the necessary treatment. About 2,000 cancer patients are currently in need of treatment overseas, which is twice as many as the number of cancer cases that were supposed to be referred for overseas treatment prior to 7 October. Meanwhile, 225,000 individuals with high blood pressure, 45,000 patients with cardiovascular illnesses, and 71,000 individuals with diabetes face a severe lack of medications and treatments, in addition to malnutrition. There are between 1,000 and 1,500 kidney failure patients in the Strip, and these patients' health conditions are rapidly worsening due to a lack of medical and therapeutic services, medications, and other necessities. The collapse of the health system has put immense strain on hospitals' facilities and their services, most of which are disrupted by damage, the siege, and disruptions in fuel, electricity, and clean water supplies. As a result, patients are no longer receiving regular dialysis services. Nearly 60 kidney failure patients are at risk of death at any moment, and at least 20 others have already died. Both elderly and younger people have died, some taking their last breaths while using dialysis machines as a result of not having access to electricity, water, or the necessary medical resources for their cases. The difficult security conditions and prolonged home confinement of patients during Israeli ground operations have also increased the number of kidney failure patients who died because they were unable to get to a hospital. According to a report by Juzor for Health and Social Development, the inability to continue renal dialysis, the lack of insulin and other life-saving cardiac medications, fuel shortages, scarcity of clean water, and lack of electricity means thousands of people with cardiovascular diseases, CVD, asthma, kidney disease, or diabetes are unable to treat to control their condition. This will result in an increasingly rapid number of deaths. Additionally, 700,000 cases of infectious disease infections, including 8,000 cases of viral hepatitis, have been reported in the Strip. The Gaza Strip's residents have also been subjected to constant psychological pressure over the course of the 6 months of intense Israeli military attacks, forcing roughly 2 million of them to evacuate their homes. They are now living in cramped housing, shelter centers, or tents, lacking basic amenities for health and hygiene, as well as under heavy and continuous bombardment with no safe havens. These circumstances will negatively impact the Strip's residents' psychological and mental well-being in the long run. In a recent report, mental health and child protection experts working with Save the Children in Gaza said that without urgent action, starting with an immediate definitive ceasefire and safe, unfettered humanitarian access, the war will inflict further lifelong detrimental mental harm, with rapidly shrinking opportunities to recover. Those surveyed for the new report said they had witnessed a dramatic deterioration in the mental health of children that is much worse than during previous escalations in violence, manifesting in fear, anxiety, disordered eating, bedwetting, hypervigilance, and sleep problems, as well as behavioral changes such as an alternation in attachment style with parents, regression, and aggression. The report further pointed out that the children as young as 12 years old were among those arbitrarily detained. Torture, inhumane treatment, and sexual violence. All of these violations are part of a larger Israeli effort to dehumanize all Palestinians in the Gaza Strip in order to justify and normalize the crimes being committed against them. Physically crushing civilians with tanks is just one of the many cruel ways that the Israeli army murders and harms Palestinian civilians in the Gaza Strip, disregarding their humanity, suffering, and dignity. These practices reflect the desire of Israel's government and military to collectively punish the Palestinian people, with the aim of destroying, intimidating, and/or harming them physically and psychologically. These crimes come alongside a public incitement campaign by Israeli officials, media figures, and settlers calling for the annihilation of Palestinians in the Gaza Strip, and are also a result of the total impunity enjoyed by the perpetrators, evident by the absence of any meaningful action being taken to hold them accountable by any party or at any level. Palestinian prisoners and detainees have been subject to cruel torture practices that appear to have a sadistic bent. These attacks have left deep wounds and numerous scars on the survivors' bodies and have negatively affected their psychological health. The attacks have been carried out in retaliation as a collective punishment for being Palestinians, within the plan in place of targeting them as a national and ethnic group, as a tangible embodiment of the crime of genocide. The Israeli military has arbitrarily detained hundreds of Palestinian citizens, including women and children, after being stripped, blindfolded, and made to spend hours in the freezing cold. Many Palestinian detainees have been transported against their will to unidentified locations, where they have endured torture and inhumane treatment, such as being denied access to food, water, shelter, and restrooms. The Israeli army continues to commit the crime of forced disappearance against prisoners and detainees from the Gaza Strip in a widespread and systematic manner. It refuses to acknowledge the deprivation of their freedom by withholding disclosure of lists containing the names of all prisoners and detainees from the Strip, as well as information about their fate, thereby denying them the legal protection they are entitled to for extended periods of time. Many of them have been subjected to physical and psychological torture, sexual violence, and threats throughout their detention. Additionally, some detainees have been subjected to bargaining and blackmail attempts in order to coerce cooperation with the Israeli army and Shin Bet, often in exchange for the alleviation of their torture, the granting of certain privileges, or their release. The Israeli army has been authorized to conduct arrest operations arbitrarily and randomly on a large scale in the Gaza Strip under the provisions of the Unlawful Combatants Law, which deprives prisoners and detainees of all rights accorded to them by international humanitarian law and human rights standards, including legal protections. This law exempts them from being treated as detainees under the 1949 Fourth Geneva Convention, as well as the first protocol to the Geneva Conventions, or as prisoners of war under the 1949 Third Geneva Convention. With the onset of the crime of genocide in the Gaza Strip, the Unlawful Combatants Law was amended to allow for the detention of Palestinians there for a maximum of 75 days, with the possibility of an indefinite extension, based on secret evidence that neither the detainee nor his attorney is allowed to view, depriving them of their right to a fair trial and legal representation. In this context, experts at the United Nations issued a statement expressing their concern over credible reports of egregious human rights violations against Palestinian women and girls in the Palestinian territories, including the Gaza Strip. These violations include deliberate killings, extrajudicial executions, arbitrary detention, enforced disappearances, torture, sexual violence including rape and threats of rape, forced nudity, strip searches by male personnel, inhumane treatment, assault on human dignity, and deprivation of their basic human rights considering their gender. The statement highlighted the case of an infant forcibly transferred by an Israeli officer into Israel, whose fate remains unknown since then, in clear violation of international humanitarian law. C. Genocide by deliberately inflicting conditions of life calculated to bring about physical destruction. The Israeli military persists in implementing policies designed to starve Palestinian civilians, forcibly relocate them, and compel them to leave their homes and communities, forcibly transferring them to the southern Gaza Strip and destroying protected civilian property. These actions contravene international law, particularly humanitarian law, constituting war crimes under the Rome Statute of the International Criminal Court. Forced displacement. The Israeli army executes the crime of forced displacement by carrying out coercive atmosphere across the entirety of the Gaza Strip, devoid of safe havens or secure spaces. This includes a sustained use of physical force, conducting intense and targeted military assaults on residential areas, invading shelters and residences, and coercing Palestinians to evacuate without offering viable alternatives. Moreover, these measures encompass tactics such as starvation, threats, intimidation, detention, psychological coercion, and the ongoing issuance of illegal eviction orders. Numerous times as people were being displaced along roads that had previously been deemed safe routes, the Israeli army opened fire on them directly. About 2 million people have been forcibly displaced as a result of the harsh living conditions imposed by the Israeli army, which has been waging war on the Gaza Strip for 6 continuous months. Most of these people have been relocated multiple times and are currently living in shelter centers that are not meant for this purpose, where they are extremely overcrowded, or in dilapidated tents that lack basic necessities. The Israeli army is actively evacuating the remaining civilians in Gaza City and the Gaza Strip's northern region. On 18 March, the Israeli army issued new displacement orders demanding, quote, all those present and displaced in the Al-Ramal neighborhood and in Al-Shifa Hospital and its surrounding areas to evacuate to the west via Al-Rashid Street and later to the south to Al-Mawasi area. In the following days, Israeli forces raided dozens of homes, mistreated their inhabitants, detained dozens, and forcibly displaced the rest into southward within the Strip. Israeli forces also stormed the American school, which houses roughly 20 displaced families. Israeli army soldiers arrested an unspecified number of young men who were displaced from the American school and asked the women to evacuate via Al-Rashid Street to the city of Deir al-Balah, central Gaza Strip. Meanwhile, Israel deliberately deepens the catastrophic starvation crisis for all Gazans by depriving them of basic necessities and obstructing the entry and distribution of humanitarian supplies, especially in Gaza City and the northern Strip, intending to forcibly displace the Palestinian people there. Despite the famine spreading in Gaza City and the northern areas of the Strip, and the rising death toll due to hunger, malnutrition, and drought, including among children and infants, Israel persists in severely obstructing and limiting the delivery of crucial humanitarian assistance to the population in these areas. This indicates an Israeli determination to starve these civilians as a reprisal for their refusal to comply with unlawful Israeli eviction orders, while continuing to pressure them to abandon their homes and undergo forced displacement towards the south. Rendering the Gaza Strip uninhabitable. In the meantime, the Israeli army keeps destroying houses, neighborhoods, and communities in a systematic and widespread manner, making it impossible for those who have been forcibly displaced to return to their homes in the near future. Over 350,000 homes in the Gaza Strip have been destroyed by the Israeli army since the start of the military attacks. Israeli forces continue to blow up, bomb, and demolish homes for no military or security reasons, but rather to destroy every aspect of life, in addition to stealing the money, possessions, and property of Palestinian citizens. It is estimated that the Israeli army has so far stolen tens of millions of shekels by Special Army Unit. This is in addition to the random looting carried out by other soldiers of the Israeli army. Following the ICJ's decision, Israeli forces blew up 167 residential squares containing hundreds of residential units, in addition to hundreds of other residential units that it destroyed by air and artillery bombardment. One of the most notable recent events was the Israeli army's destruction of dozens of residential units in Hamad Residential City in Khan Yunis, which has been subjected to the most extensive destruction in the Gaza Strip. About 80% of its buildings and infrastructure have been destroyed. Meanwhile, Israeli forces persist in targeting Gaza's healthcare sector, including hospitals and medical personnel. Between 7 October 2023 and 12 February 2024, Israeli forces carried out 378 attacks on healthcare facilities across the Gaza Strip, damaging 98 health facilities and 98 ambulances. 13 out of 35 hospitals in Gaza were only partially operational as of 7 February, meaning that there are no fully operational hospitals in the Strip. This month, the Israeli army attacked the Al-Amal and Nasser hospitals, essentially shutting them down by detaining and arresting scores of medical personnel, as well as turning off the electricity. As a result, at least 8 patients in the Nasser hospital died. As the ongoing Israeli bombing campaign has prevented medical personnel and the families of victims from burying their loved ones, dozens of the dead have been buried in mass graves in the courtyards of the 2 hospitals mentioned above. Finally, the Israeli army has continued its efforts to erase the Palestinian identity from the land and sever its historical ties with its Palestinian people. This has been executed through the demolition of Palestinian historical, cultural, educational, and religious sites in the Gaza Strip. According to the Palestinian National Library, Israeli forces have demolished a total of 26 cultural and theatrical centers, at least 325 buildings housing cultural and historic sites, 208 mosques, 5 libraries, and 2 churches. Additionally, Israeli forces have targeted 44 cultural and scientific figures. D. Genocide by imposing measures intended to prevent births. Whole population. During the reporting period, Israel continued to kill thousands of Palestinian men and women in the Gaza Strip, most of them in their reproductive years, including pregnant women, and hundreds of children, including infants. There is no doubt that Israel's systematic and widespread killings of Palestinian civilians, who made up at least 92% of the total number of deaths, 41,000 Palestinians, with thousands among them having died under the rubble, alongside the approximately 75,000 injuries and wounds they caused, will have a detrimental effect on the rate of population growth and the ability of Palestinians to procreate both now and in the future. This is especially true given that the percentage of deaths and injuries represents more than 5% of the Gaza Strip's total population. Destroying families' unity. In addition to killing and attacking civilians, Israel is committing a forced displacement crime by compelling about 2 million Palestinian men and women to flee their homes and take shelter in tents and shelter centers not intended for this use, such as schools and hospitals. This situation has led to the forced separation of Palestinian family members, with many separated from each other according to gender due to overcrowding and lack of privacy. Given the severity of the injuries and severe physical and psychological damage inflicted on Palestinians as a result of Israeli aggression, as well as the massive destruction inflicted by Israel on the property and homes of Palestinian civilians, these conditions will inevitably result in limiting reproductive opportunities for Palestinians in the Gaza Strip, both in the short and long term, making it impossible for these families to reunite under a safe and private roof anytime soon. Women and children. The crimes committed by Israel against the people of the Gaza Strip have a disproportionately negative impact on women and children. Due to the lack of access to specialized medical services, severe population overcrowding, hospital outages, and the spread of diseases and epidemics, women continue to face significant challenges, particularly those who are pregnant, giving birth, or who recently became mothers. Palestinian women in the enclave are forced to give birth with little or no medical help, and in dirty, overcrowded shelters, public bathrooms, and makeshift tents. Expectant mothers who make it to the hospitals in Gaza rarely get the level of care they need, as the facilities are short-staffed and overwhelmed by the number of war wounded, where infection and other health issues are more likely to occur due to poor hygiene and unsterilized medical equipment. Thousands of women receive C-sections without anesthesia, while doctors in Gaza have turned to hysterectomies to halt childbirth-related bleeding due to the lack of specialists and medications. Palestinian women in the Gaza Strip are also forced to take birth control pills to stop their menstrual cycle, given the lack of sanitary pads, personal hygiene products, and painkillers. In addition to infants dying from hunger due to a lack of available formula and mothers' incapacity to breastfeed as a result of their own dehydration and malnutrition, there has been a rise in newborn deaths in the Gaza Strip as a result of preventable causes such as diarrhea, common colds, and infectious diseases. The reproductive violence imposed by Israel on the Palestinian population in the Gaza Strip, particularly women, is likely to impair their ability to conceive and will have serious consequences for Palestinians in Gaza as a national and ethnic group for several generations. This falls within the meaning of acts of genocide under Article 2 of the Convention on the Prevention and Punishment of the Crime of Genocide. Second, the measure regarding Israel's obligation to ensure with immediate effect that its military does not commit any of the acts of genocide. Israel failed to take any special measures or procedures to ensure that its army does not commit acts of genocide in the Gaza Strip. There are no directives, decisions, or orders from the Israeli political or military authorities that forbid Israeli army personnel from carrying out, encouraging, or taking part in acts of genocide, or that penalize them should they carry out such acts. On the contrary, institutions and bodies in Israel are dedicated to safeguarding and supporting members of the Israeli military through various official and grassroots methods. This involves enacting laws to grant them legal and judicial immunity, refraining from imposing penalties on those responsible for such acts, and utilizing media and religious institutions as platforms for praising and encouraging such actions while intimidating dissenters. The Israeli army is still committing the crime of genocide on a daily basis with complete impunity, without fear of repercussions or accountability, as more footage showing Israeli soldiers committing crimes and violations against Palestinian civilians and their property in Gaza Strip continues to be published on social media. Despite the extensive documentation of thousands of crimes captured on video depicting soldiers committing acts falling within the scope of this crime, such as celebrating the killing of Palestinian civilians, torturing and humiliating detainees, capturing moments of demolishing and looting homes, demolishing mosques, and burning Korans, the Israeli authorities have failed to take any action against them. They have not held them accountable or pursued legal measures, not even symbolically. Israel has announced the formation of investigation committees, but with no subsequent real action or thorough investigations. This was the case following the 29 February flower massacre of people waiting for aid supplies at the Nabulsi roundabout. The Israeli army initially claimed to be investigating the incident and then presented a narrative in which it denied any responsibility, although all available evidence pointed to it being fully responsible for carrying out the massacre. As a result, the perpetrators escaped the penalty. Another example of Israel's failure to seriously investigate crimes and its unwillingness to hold army personnel accountable for committing them in the Gaza Strip is the, quote, command note received by Brigadier General Barak Hiram of the Israeli military's 99th Division for the demolition without the necessary authorization of the Isra University building in the Gaza Strip earlier this year. The quote command note is not considered a penalty, as it will not affect the officer's rank and will not prevent his promotion. The note was issued because he decided to blow up the university building without obtaining the approval of his commander, the head of the Southern Command, Major General Yaron Finkelman, who told him at the time, "If you had submitted the request to destroy the university, I would have approved it." Accordingly, the command note was issued not because the officer actually destroyed a building that was meant for education, but rather because he gave the order to destroy the university without the required approval. Third, the measure regarding Israel's commitment to prevent and punish public incitement to genocide. Israel has not shown any seriousness in investigating public incitement to genocide against Palestinians in the Gaza Strip. In addition, Israel has not yet launched an investigation into these violations or brought charges against any civilians, military personnel, or political figures implicated in inciting the extermination of Palestinians in the Gaza Strip. In fact, more statements have been made expressing Israel's determination to carry out the crime of genocide, and no steps have been taken by Israel to guarantee the safety of Palestinian civilians. Recent incitements of genocide. The last such statement was made by Rabbi Eliyahu Mali, head of the Shirat Moshe religious school in Jaffa, whose students serve in the army. Mali urged his students to kill all the people of Gaza, including women and children. He claimed that those described as vandals in today's war are, quote, the children of the previous war whom we kept alive, and in reality, it is the women who produce terrorists. Regarded as the most important religious figure for the Jewish Home Party, which is part of Israel's government coalition, Rabbi Dov Lior urged Israelis to break the Sabbath in order to stop aid from getting into the Gaza Strip. 11 ministers within Prime Minister Netanyahu's right-wing government and 15 members of the Knesset participated in a conference held by the pro-settlement group Nachala on 28 January under the title Settlements Bring Security, calling for the Israeli resettlement of Gaza. After the 7th of October, history changed, the Nachala Group's director, Daniela Weiss, told NBC News. It's the end of the presence of Arabs in Gaza. It's the end. Instead of them, there will be many, many Jews that will return to the settlements that will build new settlements. At the Return to Gaza conference in occupied Jerusalem, Israeli Minister of National Security Itamar Ben-Gvir even demanded the creation of a map showing the relocation of 21 settlements that will be established in the Strip, as well as the implementation of voluntary migration for Palestinians. Video footage documents Israeli army officers promoting official incitements by Israeli officials to commit the crime of genocide against the Palestinians in the Gaza Strip, including the Amalek directives, plus additional statements of genocidal intent, dehumanizing of Palestinians, and confirmation of the practical implementation of these statements on the ground. This footage includes video footage posted to Facebook of an Israeli soldier saying, quote, "The Nakba will be a beautiful memory compared to what awaits them. We are the children of Yeshua, who conquered this land from 7 different peoples. They are not only human animals, they are also stupid." Video footage showing an Israeli soldier forcing blindfolded detainees to confess that they are slaves. Video footage of a soldier from the Netzah Yehuda battalion shouting, "We have to wait our turn to enter Gaza. We have come to spread terror." Statement by soldier Shom Gida urging the Israeli military to use 20,000 D9 bulldozers in a row to demolish Gaza completely. Fourth, the measure regarding Israel's commitment to providing humanitarian aid. Israel has used starvation not only as a tactic of war, which in itself constitutes a war crime, but also as a means of carrying out the crime of genocide against the Palestinian people in the Gaza Strip, especially in the northern Gaza Strip. continuously and severely for 6 months now. As part of its starvation campaign, Israel commits other serious crimes, including imposing a comprehensive siege on the entire Strip, cutting off fuel, electricity, and water, demolishing local food production sources, destroying crops, and bulldozing agricultural land, and repeatedly obstructing humanitarian aid. Consequently, there was acute and severe food insecurity throughout the Gaza Strip, particularly in the northern part of the Strip. Over 1 million Palestinians were experiencing actual famine, and the number of people dying from starvation and malnutrition, including infants and children, started to rise. Obstruction of humanitarian aid. The Israeli army is systematically and intentionally impeding humanitarian aid from entering the Gaza Strip, particularly in Gaza City and its northern areas. This is done by limiting the quantity and quality of aid supplies that can be allowed in, conducting drawn-out inspections, attacking starving people waiting for aid trucks, and continuing to demolish the roads and infrastructure that are required for the transportation, arrival, and distribution of humanitarian aid. Israel not only disregarded the International Court of Justice's ruling that it must take swift action to allow urgent delivery of basic services and humanitarian aid to the Gaza Strip, but it also intensified its crimes against the starving population by denying them access to aid supplies. Following the court's ruling, Israel allowed 30 to 40% fewer trucks carrying humanitarian aid to enter the Gaza Strip. Israel only allowed approximately 7,441 humanitarian aid trucks to enter the Gaza Strip during the reporting period 26th of January to 23rd of March, averaging about 125 trucks per day. However, the actual minimum requirement needed by the population of the Strip before October 7 was 500 trucks per day. Currently, the Strip needs even more, according to some estimates, especially since humanitarian aid has become the primary remaining source of food for the population due to aggression and genocide. The crisis is particularly acute and unprecedented in northern Gaza, where the number of humanitarian aid trucks allowed by Israel to enter during the reporting period did not exceed 220 trucks. The majority of these trucks were controlled by the starved population in the southern Gaza Strip, while some of the remaining trucks reached the Israeli checkpoints on Salah al-Din Road and Rashid Street in southern Gaza City. Thousands of civilians were targeted, resulting in the killing and injuring of hundreds of them. For the first time in roughly 4 months, 6 relief trucks entered the northern Gaza Strip governorate on 16 March via Salah al-Din Street, which links the southern and northern Gaza Strip. 9 trucks showed up the following day. Following agreements between local tribes and Gaza security services, these trucks were able to arrive. To undermine this agreement, though, the Israeli army assassinated on 18 March the civilian police operations official who oversaw the entry of relief trucks into northern Gaza in coordination with the tribes. This suggests that Israel may be planning to obstruct any internal arrangement that ensures the safe arrival of aid. The World Food Program, WFP, estimates that simply addressing basic food needs will require at least 300 trucks to enter Gaza every day and distribute food, especially in the north. However, WFP has only managed to take 9 convoys to the north since the start of the year. The latest of these on Sunday night involved 18 truckloads of food supplies delivered by WFP to Gaza City. The convoy, the second to use coordinated route into Gaza City and the north, delivered some 274 metric tons of wheat flour, food parcels, and ready-to-eat rations. This route needs to be made available for daily convoys and safe access to the north. Dispatching aid to the north of Gaza needs day-to-day approvals from Israeli authorities. During the long waits at the Wadi Gaza checkpoint, truck convoys face looting and are frequently turned back. If they do get through, there is a high risk of more looting along the difficult route north. Famine is spreading in the Gaza Strip. The Gaza Strip is experiencing actual famine, particularly in Gaza City and the northern Strip, with a number of deaths from starvation, malnutrition, and dehydration, including those of infants and children, rising. As of March 10, the Gaza Ministry of Health reported that the death death toll from malnutrition and dehydration in the northern Gaza had risen to 27. However, it is important to note that this number does not accurately reflect the number of people who have died from starvation. Rather, it only counts the deaths that were successfully transported to hospitals, which are difficult to reach due to road construction and fuel shortages. A report on food security in the Gaza Strip issued by the Integrated Food Security Phase Classification, IPC, confirms that famine in Gaza, especially in the northern part of the Strip, is imminent between the present time and May. Famine is a technical term referring to widespread malnutrition and associated deaths due to hunger. According to the report released on March 18th, the threshold for severe food insecurity leading to famine has been significantly exceeded, with acute malnutrition among children under the age of 5 rapidly approaching the famine threshold. It noted that rates of non-conflict related deaths, the ultimate indicator of famine, are accelerating, although data remains limited, as is often the case in conflict zones. Overall, the new report shows that 1.1 million people in Gaza, half the population, have completely exhausted the food supplies and coping capacities and are struggling with catastrophic hunger, IPC Phase 5, and starvation. People in Gaza are starving to death right now, the report warned, noting that thousands of children will be dead if no action is taken. This represents the largest number of people ever recorded facing catastrophic hunger by the Integrated Food Security Phase Classification (IPC) system. It's a stark contrast to the lower figure projected in the Phase 5 famine classification issued just 3 months ago. World Food Program WFP chief economist Arif Hussein warned in a press conference that famine is imminent in the northern part of the Gaza Strip, and the entire population of Gaza is facing crisis levels of food insecurity or worse. Quote, "You can clearly see that, in a way, famine is an admission of collective failure," he said. "We should act way before the famine, so people don't starve, children are not wasted, and people don't die of hunger-related causes. People in Gaza are starving to death right now. The speed at which this man-made hunger and malnutrition crisis has ripped through Gaza is terrifying," said WFP Executive Director Cindy McCain. "There is a very small window left to prevent an outright famine, and to do that, we need immediate and full access to the north. If we wait until famine has been declared, it's too late. Thousands more will be dead." The malnutrition crisis in Gaza is accelerating at an unprecedented pace due to the alarming lack of food, water, and health services, according to the World Food Program, WFP. WFP adds that the crisis heightens the risk of long-term health impacts and is disproportionately affecting women and children, with 90% of mothers and children not eating a diverse diet. Despite the widespread famine and the growing risk of death from hunger and drought, Israel continues to commit the crime of starving Palestinians. There has been no alteration in its arbitrary policies obstructing humanitarian aid entry into the region, suggesting Israel's intent is to impose severe living conditions on Palestinians, ultimately leading to their destruction. Fifth, the measure related to Israel's commitment to prevent the destruction and ensure the preservation of evidence. Israel has persisted in committing crimes that are systematic and widespread, destroying civilian property and objects. Several of these locations have been the target of repeated Israeli attacks, which has resulted in the destruction of some crucial evidence connected to these crimes. Furthermore, the Israeli army is purposefully enclosing and besieging areas where crimes against Palestinian civilians are occurring, making it difficult for journalists, civil defense crews, and humanitarian workers to enter the area. This prevents the opportunity to accurately monitor and document these crimes in a timely manner before relevant evidence is lost or destroyed. In an effort to distort and conceal the truth, the Israeli army not only targets civilian objects, but also murders, attacks, and detains witnesses, including Palestinian journalists, destroys their broadcast vehicles and photography equipment, and seizes their media materials. There have been 134 Palestinian journalists killed since the Israeli aggression began, the highest number of journalists killed in conflicts in modern history. Although they are easily identifiable by wearing their press jackets and helmets and using press cars with their characteristic badges, these journalists are directly targeted during their journalistic work. Additionally, Israel prevents investigative and fact-finding committees from visiting the Gaza Strip. For instance, Israel denied Ms. Francesca Albanese, the special rapporteur on the situation of human rights in the Palestinian territories occupied since 1967, entry into the Gaza Strip on 12 February. On 19 March, Israel also barred Mr. Philippe Lazzarini, the director of the United Nations Relief and Works Agency for Palestinian Refugees, UNRWA, from entering the Strip. Furthermore, Israel refuses to collaborate with any UN investigative body, even regarding the alleged violations that occurred on October 7, including the Office of the United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights and the Independent International Commission of Inquiry on the occupied Palestinian territory, including East Jerusalem and Israel. While Israel obstructs access for investigative committees, international journalists, and media, it unilaterally circulates what it alleges to be, quote, evidence to evade accountability for its crimes against Palestinians in Gaza. This dissemination happens without allowing external, independent, or international entities to review the evidence for authenticity, integrity, and relevance to the crimes. Israel persistently assumes the role of investigator and judge for its grave crimes and violations, aiming to obscure the truth and ensure impunity for its perpetrators. Sixth, the measure regarding Israel's commitment to submit a report to the court on all measures taken. 1 month after the court's ruling and just hours before the deadline set by the International Court of Justice, Israel submitted its report to the court regarding the measures it has taken to implement the court's decision issued on January 26th. Despite Israel's timely submission of this report, seemingly the only measure it has adhered to among the 6 measures ruled by the court 2 months ago, evaluating its content remains impossible at present. This is because the contents of the report are still confidential and it has not yet been released to the media or been made available for public scrutiny. Conclusion and recommendations. Israel has continued to commit the crime of genocide against the Palestinian civilians of the Gaza Strip since October 7. In doing so, it violates the peremptory norms of international law, among which the prohibition of committing genocide is considered one of the most important, as well as its international obligations as a state party to relevant conventions and treaties, notably the Convention on the Prevention and Punishment of the Crime of Genocide and the Geneva Conventions of 1949. Additionally, Israel's non-compliance with the International Court of Justice's decision issued on January 26th and its violation of the provisional measures imposed by the court to protect the Palestinian people in the Gaza Strip from the risk of genocide further exacerbate the situation. The court found reasonable grounds to believe that Israel's actions in the Strip could potentially amount to genocide, according to the definition provided in the Convention on the Prevention and Punishment of the Crime of Genocide. Nevertheless, 2 months after the International Court of Justice's ruling, Israel proceeded to carry out the crime of genocide at the same scale, including killing of civilians, targeting of civilians in military attacks, use of illegal, indiscriminate, and highly destructive weapons, the infliction of severe physical and psychological harm, starvation, collective punishment, forced displacement, arbitrary detention, enforced disappearance, torture, sexual abuse, denial of health care, separation of families, and prevention of procreation. Israel has also continued its crimes in a manner that renders the Gaza Strip uninhabitable and eradicates its Palestinian identity through the systematic destruction of sources of income, infrastructure, civilian objects, and private property, and intentionally targeting of religious, educational, artistic, and historic buildings, hospitals, and medical centers. Israel has in fact committed more violations in some instances than it did in the time leading up to the court's ruling, particularly in relation to the entry of humanitarian relief aid. It is noteworthy that the serious crimes and violations perpetrated by Israel in the Gaza Strip over the last 6 months, which fall within the scope of the genocide being carried out against the Strip's population in a widespread and systematic manner, are also considered standalone war crimes and crimes against humanity. This is in accordance with the Geneva Conventions and the Rome Statute of International Criminal Court. Consequently, they require immediate international accountability, including judicial accountability. As an example, Israel has been employing starvation both as a tactic to carry out genocide against Palestinian civilians in the Strip over the past 6 months and as a weapon of war in Gaza, which constitutes a war crime. Israel intentionally denies Palestinian civilians in Gaza, especially those in Gaza City and the northern regions, access to essential resources necessary for their survival by destroying local production sources and restricting access to and distribution of humanitarian aid, the primary remaining food source for the population in the area. According to international humanitarian law, Israel, as the occupying power, is obligated to provide the population with food, medical supplies, clothing, bedding, shelter, and other essential materials necessary for the survival of civilians in the occupied territories, as well as for worship. However, Israel continues to commit serious crimes and violate its international obligations as the occupying authority in endangering the lives of Palestinian civilians in the Gaza Strip as a whole, with a risk of famine and severe hunger. These risks stem primarily from its aggression and the illegal siege it imposes on the Gaza Strip, in addition to the genocide it perpetrates. Recommendations. In light of the aforementioned, Euromed Human Rights Monitor 1. Urges the international community to uphold its legal and moral duties towards itself and the Palestinian civilians in the Gaza Strip, and activate genuine pressure tools to compel Israel to immediately cease committing genocide and all of its crimes, and to pressure it to comply with the rules of international law and the decision of the International Court of Justice to protect Palestinian civilians from the danger of genocide in Gaza. 2. Calls on all states to fulfill their international obligations and halt all military, financial, and political support for Israel's aggression against the Gaza Strip. All arms transfers to Israel, including export permits and military assistance. Otherwise, these countries would be complicit and partners in the crimes committed in Gaza, including genocide. 3. Calls on the high contracting parties to the 1949 Fourth Geneva Convention to fulfill their obligations to cease the grave violations committed by Israel against Palestinian civilians in Gaza under Articles 146, 147, and 148 of the Convention, and to pressure Israel to comply with its legal obligations as the occupying power, which bears primary responsibility for providing food, medical supplies, and other essential items to the population of the Gaza Strip, according to Articles 55 and 56 of the Convention. 4. Urges for immediate international action to compel Israel to halt its starvation tactics against the Palestinian civilians in the Gaza Strip, fully lift the blockade on the Gaza Strip, establish suitable mechanisms for the safe and swift delivery of humanitarian aid, and undertake decisive steps to combat the swiftly escalating famine in the Strip. 5. Calls for resuming funding for UNRWA immediately, as it is the main humanitarian agency in the Gaza Strip, on which more than 2 million people depend for survival, putting an end to collective punishment against the Palestinian people, and supporting UNRWA and all other humanitarian institutions operating in the Gaza Strip. 6. Calls for international investigations into the violations that have been documented since Israel began its military attacks on the Gaza Strip, safeguarding the evidence to ensure justice and compensation for the victims. In addition, it calls for the International Criminal Court to expedite its investigation procedures and to prioritize addressing the situation in the Gaza Strip. This will invoke working to end the policy of impunity enjoyed by Israel, including all those who carry out and issue orders, and holding those responsible for these actions accountable. 7. urges for enabling the entry of international and UN investigation committees into the Gaza Strip to prevent the destruction of Israeli crimes evidence, including the Independent International Commission of Inquiry on the Occupied Palestinian Territory, including East Jerusalem and Israel. 8. Demands sending an open invitation to the UN Human Rights Council's special procedures, including the special rapporteurs on the occupied Palestinian territories, extrajudicial, summary, or arbitrary executions, torture, adequate housing, the right to food, violence against women and girls, and the working groups on arbitrary detention and the working group concerned with enforced or involuntary disappearances to immediately and thoroughly investigate Israeli crimes committed against Palestinians in the Gaza Strip, each in accordance with their mandate and reporting their findings to all relevant authorities and entities, paving the way for international investigation committees, fact-finding missions, and international courts to consider and investigate and conduct trials on Israeli crimes. 9. Demands that national and international institutions step up their efforts to monitor, document, and report on crimes committed by Israel and disseminate information about them on a wide scale, to enhance the capacity to hold Israel accountable, including regarding its violation of the International Court of Justice's decision. 10. Calls to ensure justice, compensate, and redress Palestinian victims, and repair the damage caused by the serious crimes and grave violations committed by Israel in the Gaza Strip, in accordance with the rules of international law. And that concludes this reading of the Euromed Human Rights Monitor's report, titled 2 months after the International Court of Justice's ruling on Gaza, Escalation in Genocide and Absence of Accountability, published in March 2024. And that will wrap up this episode of You Can't Be Neutral. You can check out all the back episodes at youcan'tbeneutral.com. And to find out when those episodes come out or other things going on, you can follow me in the Fediverse at Moving Train Media at collectiva.social. You can also listen to this and all my podcasts playing 24/7 at movingtrainradio.com. And from the album From Sheffield to Palestine, which is a compilation album, which you can find on Bandcamp, this is the track Welcome to Gaza by the Karlos Collective with our moment of Zinn. Thanks for listening.
See the day your house demolished when you went away. Did you ever hurt inside, seeing children running anywhere to hide? Did you ever feel that shame? See that man screaming in pain. Did you ever have that in your life? Should you ever have that in your sight? Why don't you come and see the nice cold family lying next to me? Do they know what they feel about the hunters bearing down with youthful zeal? Did you ever the pain it's all the same. Bring your guns, bring your bombs, watch us fight.